What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-800-585-9396.
What's stopping?
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-800-585-9396.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hi, everybody. Welcome again to Call to Communion. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Those of you who are not Catholic are welcome to call in and ask your questions. Maybe you've got a couple of questions about the Catholic faith. You weren't quite sure who you could send those to. Well, you can certainly send them to us. Here's our phone number, 1-800-585-9396, 1-800-585-9396. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for the response and then text us your first name and your question. Message and data rates may apply. Again, the phone number, 1-800-585-9396. We will also take your emails, ctc@ewtn.com. As a matter of fact, we're going to be recording one of our fabulous mailbag programs tomorrow at about 1 p.m. Eastern, just before we go live. So you may want to call in then or send us an email. We'll try to get as many of those in as we can. Michael McCall is our producer. Jeff Burson. Jeff Kabinski. Jeff Burson is our phone screener and handling social media today. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Doing very well. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing pretty well. I just came from a birthday party to celebrate the birthday of our Bishop, Robert Baker.
We're very blessed to have him as our ordinary here in Diocese of Birmingham.
We were having barbecue at the Chancery on the way over here. So if I fall asleep in the middle of the radio show, you just poke me. You know?
Well, hopefully that won't happen. Here's a quick email to lead us off here while we're waiting for those phone calls. This is from Annie, who says there seems to be a difference between how Protestants number the Psalms and how Catholics number them. How come, and where is the point of divergence? Thank you.
Okay, there are two different numberings of the Psalms that are floating around out there.
Yeah?
And it has to do with whether you're numbering them according to the Masoretic Hebrew text or the Septuagint, okay, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Right.
So that's the difference.
Nothing to it. There you go. Here's one now from Beverly in Wichita, Kansas. She says, Dr. Anders, I am a fairly new Catholic from a Protestant background. I am very confused about the difference between venial and mortal sin. I was always taught that all sin is equally abhorrent to God. The little white lie told to make somebody feel better carries the same weight as murder. Catholicism seems to have varying degrees of sin. Please explain the difference and provide examples of venial sin, if you would. I truly appreciate your show. You've clarified so many things for us. God bless you and your staff.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question. And this is, of course, a major divergence between the Catholic tradition and the Protestant tradition.
Yeah.
Right? Because consistent with what you have articulated, standard classical Protestant theology teaches that the slightest deviation from the law of justice equally merits eternal damnation in hell. And so that, from the point of view of eternity, even the tiny and seems to make God's justice something that's absolutely incomprehensible with no analogy at all to human experience. Right? And that's something that Protestant theologians, they embrace that conclusion. I mean, Luther said in 1525 in his treatise on the bondage of the will that God's justice was incomprehensible. This is a standard Lutheran position, that if it was, in fact, he says if it were comprehensible, it wouldn't be divine. That for Luther, for it to be divine has to mean that it had no correspondence at all to human experience, cannot be rationally intelligible. So what is the Protestant who holds this committed to? Well, committed to the belief that he has to affirm statements about right and wrong that don't seem to make any sense just because God says so. All right? Well, Catholic position on morality is very different, all right? That a lot of our moral intuitions about justice and proportionality and fairness, they may not tell us the whole truth about God, but they're not meaningless. They're not worthless. And in daily experience, we understand that the gravity of a crime varies widely depending on the subject who's being offended and the nature of the offense. I mean, if I call you a nasty name, that's not nearly as grave an offense as if I kill you or torture you or kidnap you or something like that. All right, and if I trespass on your land, that's not nearly as grave as if I trespass on your person. All right,
of course.
And our own justice system recognizes this. All right, and on top of that, judges, when they mete out penalties for violations, not only do they take into consideration the gravity of the offense, but they also take into consideration the subjective inner disposition of the one who commits the crime. That's why in our legal system we differentiate between crimes of passion and premeditated crimes. We have degrees of murder, first, second, third degree murder.
Right.
Premeditated crime is worse. A crime of passion, not as bad. One that's performed accidentally, like manslaughter, is not punished as harshly as premeditated murder or crimes of passion. And that makes sense.
It does.
It doesn't take a PhD in ethics to see that there is some logic or reason in that. Well, the same thing holds in our divine life. Okay, there are sins by which a man or woman definitively turns away from the grace of God. Says, I reject the way of charity. By this action, I recognize that I am objectively rejecting the dignity of another human person, and I intend to subject them to usage like a mere thing, to trample under my feet their dignity, their likeness to God, or I'm going to treat God with the same kind of disdain.
Yeah.
That kind of eyes wide open, utter rejection of the dignity of God or neighbor is what we call mortal sin. And it is associated with some very specific acts, things like murder, adultery, which is a grave offense against the dignity and sacredness of marriage. Perjury, lying under oath about a matter of great significance because I want to defraud my neighbor of his livelihood. That's a very different kind of thing from, somebody says, well, how do I look this morning?
Yeah.
Oh, you look fine. You look fine.
Uh-huh.
Okay. One is motivated by maybe a, kind of a cheesy or misplaced sense of charity, and one by a genuine desire to do harm.
Yeah.
They're not the same.
No.
They're not the same. Catholic tradition says they're not the same. Scripture says they're not the same. St. Paul tells us murder, fornication, adultery, drunkenness, hatred, factions, disobedience. Galatians 5, he gives us a list. These are the kinds of things that lead to death, that kill the life of God in our soul. Venial sins are simply those little peccadillos, those little minor deviations away from the law of love that are not intrinsically grave offenses against human or divine dignity, but they are imperfections.
Very good. Beverly, thank you so much for your emailed letter there. Beverly, I note, is in Wichita. And what a great place to be a Catholic, Dave. I don't know if you follow this, but the Diocese of Wichita is apparently on fire. Bishop Kemi just, if memory serves, just ordained 10 priests and 10 transitional deacons.
That's fantastic.
They're
and
cooking.
If any diocese needs to be on fire, it's probably Wichita. I've had relatives that have been stranded there for days on end at the airport when they're covered under hundreds of feet of snow.
Oh,
so
yeah.
They
Well,
need to light some fires out
sure.
there. No, but that's fantastic news.
It really is. When we come back, we'll be talking with Terry in Springfield, Missouri, Vivian in Monticello, New York. Got a line open for you right now, 1-800-585-9396, 1-800-585-9396. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN.
Sharing the fullness of the Catholic faith. 1-800-585-9396. This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Raymond Arroyo.
Part of the success we've had on the world over, I attribute to the audience, my relationship with Mother Angelica, and her teaching me that when you sit with someone, you talk to them, and you create an environment where they will tell you things they wouldn't tell anyone else. That ease, that humor, that warmth, she gave me that, and that's what I try to impart and make a part of every interview we do on The World Over.
The World Over, tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN TV and radio.
On fire for EWTN? Get Amazon Fire TV. All you need is a high-speed internet connection, a TV, and the Amazon Fire TV player. Never miss any of your favorite EWTN television or radio programs again.
Living the Beatitudes with Father Bjorn.
Blessed are the pure in heart,
for they shall see God. While purity is an important virtue, a lot of times we can confuse this beatitude for a discussion about sexual morality. To be pure in heart is to be completely focused on and in love with God. God has given us an invitation deep within us to share in His own divine life. But it's important that we choose to focus on Him and respond to that invitation. In a homily on the Mount of Beatitudes in 2000, St. John Paul the Great says that we are called to have an urgent response to choose between life and death. In one of the earliest known Christian documents on morality, the Didache, it says there are two ways, one of life and one of death, and between the two ways is a great difference. God has called us to be focused on Him and His love. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Hi, this is Barbara McWiggin.
This is Bishop Robert Barron of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles.
This is Dr. Greg Popchak.
And Lisa Popchak.
Thanks for listening to EWTN Radio.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-800-585-9396.
Two lines open at the moment here, 1-800-585-9396. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, before we get to the phones, a quick text here from Giovanni who says, how do you explain slavery as discussed in the Old Testament?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So Catholic Church, of course, teaches that slavery is intrinsically immoral, cannot be tolerated. It's a grave violation of human dignity and the freedom and self-determination that are necessary for a person to have an authentic relationship with God and their neighbor. All right. Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 19 that the Mosaic law, especially the civil code of the Mosaic law, was a concession to human weakness and did not represent the perfection of the moral life. So there are concessions in the Mosaic law to the cultural context of the ancient Near East. The one that Jesus had in mind were laws concerning family life, divorce, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And he contrasted that with the creation ordinance in the book of Genesis, first 3 chapters, where God created them male and female. Said, what God has joined together, let man not separate, and be fruitful and multiply, and so forth. But we can extend that logic to the rest of the civil code, which is not binding on the Christian church and is not a model for what an ideal civil code ought to look like.
Very good. Let's get to the phones here and talk with Terry in Springfield, Missouri, listening to EWTN Radio on Sirius XM 130. Hey, Terry, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Dr. Anders, big fan, but I'm very nervous about this, as this has been a problem my entire life, and I was really hoping you could help me out. It's not a long story, but it's not short. But a while ago, I'd say about 15 years ago, around 2001, I was stationed in Seattle, and I met a guy at a Mariners game. I don't know if you remember the 2001 Mariners, but they were a very big deal at the time. And I met a guy, Ian Blair. And he was a very spiritual guy, and at the time I was an atheist, and the reason was when I was brought up, I knew from the start that I had preferred men, and I knew that the church did not look favorably on that. And, he kept telling me how everything was possible through God, and God loved all of His children, and He made them in His own image. And, later on we became friends, and he used to work at ESPN. He got laid off. Now
Okay. You know what, Terry?
We need to frame it as a question.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, my question is I eventually found a partner. His name's Mike Babchak.
Okay, no names, please. Just your question.
Okay, I'm sorry. All right. Well, when we adopted our son, Evan, I wanted to baptize him. Would the church baptize our son, Evan, even though I'm not a full-fledged Catholic, because it's something that's tormented me my entire life?
Okay, I appreciate the question. So a couple of things. First of all, the church will baptize. The presumption is always in favor of baptism because everything in the church is ordered towards the salvation of souls.
Sure.
And the child needs baptism and needs the Catholic faith like the rest of us do. Okay, so when parents or legal guardians bring a child for baptism, the church's main requirement is that there be some reasonable expectation that the child will be brought up as a Catholic
right.
and taught the Catholic faith.
Sure.
Okay. And that would include the truths about the moral life and the nature of the family. I mean, these are an intrinsic part of the Catholic message. So if there is a well-founded expectation that the child will be raised in the Catholic faith and taught the Catholic faith, then the priest will agree to baptize the child.
Okay, very good. Terry, thank you so much for your call. We do appreciate that. Here's our phone number, 1-800-585-9396. 1-800-585-9396. It's called a communion here on EWTN. Here's a text we just got from Adeline. What is the Catholic teaching on tattoos?
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question. Just a few moments ago, we answered a question on the show about the regulation of slavery in the Old Testament civil law code for the Hebrews.
Yeah.
And I made the point that the Old Testament civil law code is not binding on Christians, and it's not presented to us as an ideal form of civil law. Right? The Church doesn't believe that God has revealed a juridical order for civil society that has to be followed. Rather, the Scriptures, considered in their totality, give us moral norms, moral theology about human relationships and our ultimate end and destiny in God, and it's left to the prudential judgment of policymakers to work that out in different cultures at different times and in different ways. Okay, I give you that background because I'm going to tell you that the Catholic Church doesn't have a settled position on tattoos, yay or nay. All right. And I often give out that answer on the air, and the other day we got an email back from someone that was arguing the point with me and said, no, Scripture is very plain on teaching that tattoos are immoral, and she cited chapter and verse
Leviticus, right?
From the book of Leviticus.
Well.
And you have to understand that not every prescription listed in the book of Leviticus is taken just at face value as a mandate for Christian moral theology. All right, and the prohibition on tattoos in the Old Testament is like that. This is something that belonged to the civil and religious code of ancient Israel, and there's not a one-to-one correspondence between that and Christian morality. So the Church itself does not forbid people to have tattoos, and I know lots of Catholics who have them. There are priests who have them. All right, it's no barrier to becoming a clergyman. Now, I think that the proper attitude to take is one that's governed by the virtue of prudence. Right?
Sure.
And so in different times and places and cultures, tattoos may be perceived, one way or another. They may be associated with certain cultural values that you may or may not want to affirm. And certain tattoos, of course, may be more or less glorifying to God or dignifying to the human person. And one has to make that is a prudential judgment. So I won't say they're utterly neutral. They're not neutral. They have to be considered in light of those prudential judgments. But in terms of an absolute prohibition, no, the Church doesn't have any such absolute prohibition.
Very good. Hope that's helpful for you. Thank you for your text. Our phone number, 1-800-585-9396. We go to Vivian in Monticello, New York, listening online, EWTN.com. Vivian, what's your question today?
Okay, my question is, I'm a little confused about how we now are doing washing of the feet for women, as I always was taught and believed, it should be men because Jesus, the apostles were all men. So I'm a little confused about that.
Thanks, Vivian. I appreciate the question. I am not aware that the Church has changed the rubrics for Holy Thursday at all. All right. In terms of the liturgical texts and the liturgical law, as far as I understand, there's no difference. And Holy Thursday is above all the feast of the institution of the Holy Priesthood, which is one of the reasons for the washing of the feet of men. All right, because it's not just a feast about how we're all going to take care of each other and keep one another's body parts clean. It's actually a celebration of the sanctification of the priesthood. And so it's more appropriate that it be celebrated with men. All right. If there are deviations from that practice, that's what they are. They're deviations from the rubrics and the tradition of the Church.
Very good. Vivian, thank you for your call. Our phone number here, 1-800-585-9396. Niranjith, I always get this name wrong, Niranjith in Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, says, Dr. Anders, I know many fallen away Catholics. They've all embraced Buddhism. They say it's rationally intellectual. How do I respond and defend my faith?
Sure. I really appreciate the question. So, first of all, anytime we want to generalize about a religious tradition, you have to understand that when you talk about, well, what do Buddhists believe, you have to ask the question, which Buddhists?
Yeah.
Are we talking about Theravada or Mahayana? Are we talking about Zen or Pure Land? Are we talking about Thai forest traditions, or are we talking about Tibetan monasticism? I mean, there are many, many variations of Buddhist belief and practice.
Kind of like
disagree.
Protestants.
Even more diverse than that.
Wow.
They disagree radically, one from the other. And we'd have to take each of those philosophical positions in turn. But let me go just to the sort of some of the core philosophical bedrock texts of Buddhism from the Theravada tradition in the Pali Canon. And one of the key affirmations of Buddhist belief and practice is that there is no substantial reality. In particular, that there's no self, that there is no subjective human person that perdures through time. I saw this captured one time beautifully on a bumper sticker that said, "Honk if you don't exist." Okay, and that was a cheeky way of depicting this this Buddhist doctrine that's called the anatta doctrine, the doctrine of no self. Okay, well, I think that's a pretty obvious philosophical mistake. Okay, we do exist, and not only do we exist, but we have historical identity that is constant through time. If that were not the case, number one, you and I wouldn't be able to have a conversation because human syntax is diachronic. It depends on me being able to articulate words in a connected logical order from start to finish over time. And if you didn't have any perduring identity, you wouldn't know the beginning of the sentence from the end. You wouldn't be able to follow the melody of a symphony. I mean, our diachronic existence, every single moment of our life, depends on historical memory and personal identity.
Sure,
all right,
sure.
so I think it's pretty easy to falsify that doctrine. And the doctrine of anicca is an analog. The doctrine of I'm trying to remember the good English translation of that. The idea that there's no substance to reality at all. Okay, but the whole structure of Buddhism is a flat contradiction to those two affirmations, because what is it that Buddhists propose? They propose a way, the Eightfold Path of the Four Noble Truths and so forth. The whole idea of Buddhism is that I've got a structured approach to reality that I can give you, which, if you practice, will consistently lead to the experience of enlightenment. Well, you can't have any consistent expectations about a reality that doesn't substantially exist. You see? So the whole system is fraught with complication, fraught with internal illogic, with internal contradiction. Now, what I think we can say fairly about Buddhism is that many forms of Buddhism have elements of truth. Elements of truth. And I'm the first to acknowledge this. The Brahma Viharas, the four immeasurables, Buddhist virtues like compassion and sympathetic joy, and loving kindness and equanimity and so forth. These are beautiful virtues, and they correspond very well to some Christian virtues. The value of alleviating suffering or trying to escape suffering. Nothing wrong with these things. That some forms of meditative practice may in fact help people overcome their various neurotic conditions. There's nothing objectionable about these individual isolated affirmations of Buddhism, but when they're kind of lumped together into the grand philosophical synthesis of Buddhism, there are enormous complications with Buddhist philosophy, and I think that the good parts of Buddhism can be more rationally accounted for within other philosophical traditions. Might I say Catholicism?
You might indeed. Very good. Let's go now to Judy in Orange, Connecticut, listening on Sirius XM 130. Hey, Judy, what's on your mind today?
First of all, I want to thank you for your show. It's wonderful as a new Catholic to be able to gain more knowledge about the faith, so thank you.
I appreciate that.
And I wanted to ask you, I've been watching Mother Angelica's live classic shows, and I've also been reading St. Faustina's diary, and I've been trying to better understand suffering, and not doubting it, but just how they talk about how suffering brings you closer to the Lord, and also your suffering can be beneficial to, I'm not sure if I understand it correctly, either those in hell or other people suffering. And then the second part of the question is mental suffering just as important as other types of suffering that you would go through?
Judy, these are wonderful questions, all of them. They're profound, very important part of the Catholic tradition. I'm going to begin to answer them now. We're going to have to go to a break in just a second. I have no control over that, so I may have to come back and finish the question on the other side of the break. Briefly, there are several ways in which suffering is of benefit to us. One of them is pretty mundane and easy to wrap our heads around, and that's the experience that many people have of through suffering they can gain greater empathy and depth and perspective on human life. I mean, I've often talked on the show about my friend Bob Luhano, who's a quadruple amputee, and has told me many times that losing his arms and legs was the greatest thing that ever happened to him because of the experiences that it allowed to develop in his life and the relationships that he's formed and the empathy that he has for others that suffer. And I think all of us have known people like that. Maybe we've had some of those experiences ourselves. That's pretty intelligible. Makes a lot of sense. Okay. There are some more mystical, more mysterious ways in which suffering can benefit us that unfortunately we'll have to wait until after the break. So endure that suffering of the next 3 minutes. Hopefully it's not that bad.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. We'll come back after the break.
Yeah, Judy, don't go away. We'll get right back to you after the break. We'll also talk with Pam, driving through Iowa. We have a line open for you as well, 1-800-585-9396. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN.
Colin Donovan.
Entering university, I had the religious understanding of someone catechized in the 1960s. That changed when a fellow freshman asked me if a Catholic could use the pill. My uninformed answer was, sure, why not? I then went and read Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae and concluded, this is truth. I've never looked back in my love of our Catholic faith since.
Open Line with Colin Donovan, Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Hello, I'm Doug Keck, and welcome to an EWTN Bookmark Brief. I just finished interviewing Dr. Ann Hendershot on her book, Status Envy, The Politics of Catholic Higher Education. So, Ann, why don't you give us a quick synopsis of what this book is about?
Well, I wrote the book to try to let people know how we got to this place in Catholic higher education, how it is that most of the 230 Catholic colleges and universities have pretty much jettisoned their Catholic identity. And how we have just this core, this a dozen or so faithful Catholic colleges. And so I was curious how we got there. And I looked at different periods in our history. Right. And so that's what I've done.
And that's what you lay out. And it's an interesting read and a long journey. Dr. Ann Hendershot's book, Status Envy, The Politics of Catholic Higher Education. Look for the entire interview coming soon here on EWTN's Bookmark, but don't wait. It's available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Thanks for joining us.
Get an insider's look at the latest information from EWTN. Sign up for Wings, EWTN's weekly email newsletter. Get the latest information about live events, special features, and guests. Connect with EWTN on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Just go to EWTN.com and click on the Wings link to sign up. Don't miss a minute of all that's happening at EWTN. Get your wings today.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-800-585-9396.
Hey, coming up in about 30 minutes here on EWTN Radio, Father Mitch Packwell will be with us talking about church teachings on EWTN Open Line Wednesday. That'll be at 3 p.m. Eastern. And then right after that, Cresta in the afternoon at 4 Eastern. So tonight at 6 Eastern, it's Catholic Answers Live. In the first hour, Father Vincent Serpa, the chaplain of Catholic Answers, will be there to answer your questions. That'll be followed by Carlo Broussard talking about the Bible blueprint for confession. And then if you really want to rock and roll, be sure to join us tonight at 8 for EWTN Live on EWTN Radio and Television. Bear Wozniak is in the house tonight. He introduces The Long Ride Home with Bear Wozniak, his new EWTN TV series featuring a cross-country adventure in following God's will. I've seen the previews of this. It is great. It's going to be a wonderful series. That's tonight at 8 on EWTN Radio and Television, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So before the break here, we were talking with Judy in Connecticut, who really wants to understand suffering a little bit better.
Yeah, thank you so much. So she wanted to know in particular how suffering unites us to God or helps us to become better, and how it might benefit, how our suffering might benefit others in particular.
Right.
So before the break, we talked about, I think, a very common experience of benefiting from suffering that it's not hard to understand, and that's that we can grow in our depth as persons and develop empathy for others and so forth, gain more gratitude, to come to appreciate the more important things of life when we become detached from the superficialities and are really forced to confront what really matters. That's an experience of benefiting and growing through suffering that many people have had, and I think a lot can relate to. And if you've ever met somebody who's a real apologist for AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, they're a wonderful example of this. I mean, I've met some guys in AA, and they really get a mission in life to help others, and they're there because they went through the ringer. They had to hit rock bottom, and through that experience they gained a lot of empathy, because that's a very human way of growing from the experience of suffering. Then there's a more mystical way of growing from the experience of suffering. The heart of Christian discipleship is to follow the Blessed Virgin Mary, who said, "Be it done to me according to thy word."
Right.
All right. And Jesus said the same thing. "I have come not to do my will, but the will of him who sent me." All right. The surrender to divine providence, in spite of all appearances that, my life is not going well, everything seems to be against me, and yet I know that not a sparrow falls apart from the will of God. And so even though it doesn't look like God is blessing me at this moment, I will confess in faith that God knows what he's doing, that my life has purpose and meaning and value, even though I may not think it does, I don't feel like it does.
Right.
And I'll surrender to the will of God, and with the Blessed Virgin Mary, with our Lord, say, "Be it done to me according to thy word," even if it turns out a way that I don't find very pleasant. Right?
Yeah.
Well, when we do that, when we surrender to God's providence in that way, that's meritorious. Right? That is something that is above and beyond, right? I mean, that it takes supernatural faith and the virtue of hope that all things will turn out well. Everything will turn out well for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. If we have that supernatural faith and hope enlivened by charity, then that surrender to divine providence becomes meritorious. Now, the beautiful thing about merit is that if we earn favor with God, Jesus says, if we even give a cup of cold water to one of these little ones, you won't lose your reward. Okay, God does in fact recompense meritorious deeds. That the merit of our sacrifices can be distributed on behalf of others. St. Paul talks about this in Colossians chapter 1, verse 24. He says, "I fill up in my own flesh what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church." Do you remember in the book of Genesis, Abraham argues with God and says, will you destroy the righteous along with the wicked? And God says, "No, for the sake of 10 righteous, I'll spare all these wicked in the city of Sodom." God will recompense, God will benefit the many on behalf of the righteousness of the few. And nothing is more righteous, nothing is more meritorious than following the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, if someone strikes you on the left cheek, turn to him the other also. The willing embrace and surrender of suffering, taking up the way of the cross, following Jesus, lay down our lives for others, even to the embrace of suffering. Nothing's more meritorious for our own salvation and for those around us than that form of total surrender to the will of God. Believe it or not, I think the normal way of engaging that kind of suffering for many people is to fully embrace the meaning of Christian marriage. In Ephesians chapter 5, the metaphor that is given to us for married life is not the eternal honeymoon in the Caribbean. It's the way of the cross, right? Where we surrender our own interests and our own pleasures and our own aspirations on behalf of the welfare of our spouse and our children. All right, the way of the cross. That's what St. Paul says. Be like Jesus, who gave his own life for the sake of his bride, the church. Right? That's the way of the cross. Now, the other part of the question was, what about mental anguish? It cannot also be meritorious. And I'd say absolutely. In fact, mental anguish almost always accompanies physical suffering. This is what Job went through, right?
Oh yeah.
The holy man Job, he had all kinds of physical suffering. But the real challenge that Job faced was his companions that said, "Curse God and die," right? Because this thing has happened to you. And Job said, "Absolutely not. I'm not going to curse God and die in spite of my physical suffering." But the temptation there to give up hope in the face of whatever physical challenges I may confront, that's honestly sometimes the hardest part of suffering, is the emotional anguish that accompanies those unfavorable circumstances. What does this mean about, am I valuable? Is my life meaningful? Has God abandoned me? And here's where the depth of Catholic mysticism really kicks in. All of the saints experience this. And the deeper they go into holiness, the more they experience it. And at the heights of the mystical life, there's a darkness and an absence of God that most of us don't experience. All right, it's not just the same thing as depression. It's deeper than that. St. John of the Cross talks about it. He calls it the dark night of the soul, where we come to experience God's presence precisely through his absence. It's a very, very profound form of mystical darkness and intense suffering, and it precedes the final union of the soul with God, when one learns to abandon oneself entirely to the providence of God in the deepest and darkest recesses of the soul. All right, and it's entirely of a mental and spiritual character, even though it may be precipitated by physical suffering. So, if a person is going through mental anguish, this too is a principal means of crucifying us with Christ and bringing us into conformity with the will of God, if we willingly surrender to divine providence. Now, does that mean that we should not try to alleviate suffering? No, it doesn't mean that. And many times our mental anguish is caused not by conformity to the will of God, but because of things that are beyond our control, or things that we have maybe suffered in childhood, or perhaps even genetic conditions over which we have no control, where we may be helped by therapy or medication or cognitive behavioral science or whatever it might be. And it's perfectly acceptable to seek to alleviate that kind of suffering. And I would urge people who are suffering from depression or other neurotic disorders to seek that kind of relief. But in the meanwhile, say with the Blessed Virgin Mary, "Be it done to me according to thy word."
Judy, is that helpful for you?
Oh, yeah. I really was having a hard time fully understanding it, and now I have a better idea as to, what they were trying to accomplish, both, Saint Celestina and Mother Angelica, when they talked of suffering. So thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank
you so much as well. Our phone number, 1-800-585-9396. In a moment, we're going to get to a text from Crystal in Cleveland, Ohio. First, though, a call from Pam, who's driving through Iowa, listening to us on the EWTN app. Hey, Pam, what's your question today?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what is Dr. David Andrews' take on my grandchild is going to a Catholic school, and one of the teachers was born and raised and went to a Catholic school, graduated, and now is a teacher, but now all of a sudden she's converted to Baptism or the Baptist and been dunked in the tank or whatever they call that, and I was just wondering, she's still there, so I didn't know what the take is of having somebody still teaching in the school.
Sure. I appreciate the question. So there's a wonderful document published in 1977 by the Sacred Congregation for Catholic Education called simply The Catholic School, that lays out the Church's philosophy of education and what a Catholic school ought to look like. And a Catholic school is supposed to do a lot more than just educate the mind for a career. It's supposed to do a lot more even than simple catechesis. But in fact, the Catholic school is supposed to be a center for the formation of the total person and the transmission of a culture that's been utterly transformed by the gospel. And the Catholic faith is supposed to integrate every aspect of the curriculum, not only in religious instruction and catechesis, but even, believe it or not, there's a Catholic perspective on math. There's a Catholic perspective on biology. There's a Catholic perspective on all of the sciences, and a way to bring faith and reason into dialogue. That, of course, to do that effectively requires a very well-formed administration and a well-formed faculty and a total commitment on the part of the entire body to the Catholic mission and vision of the school. Okay. Now, as a practical matter, that's very difficult to pull off. That's a hard job to do that. All right, it's an ongoing task. It requires ongoing catechesis, and in some places, I live in the South. We're Catholics, like 1-2% of the population down here. Okay, it's hard, very, very difficult to come up with qualified, educated Catholic faculty to fill every single slot in a Catholic school. And would we like to have that? Absolutely. Okay, but to lay down as a law, well, you absolutely cannot hire, a Baptist math teacher. Well, that'd be a little bit rough, because you got to make judicious, prudential judgments about, how can I best meet all of the needs of the students in accord with the Catholic vision of the school. Now, if the Catholic population of a faculty begins to diminish to the point where it is really seriously impeding the Catholic mission of the school, well, then you gotta really reassess. Does it mean you can never hire a non-Catholic teacher in a Catholic school? No, it doesn't mean that. You keep the mission out front. Make sure that everybody understands the mission, that they're on board with the mission. I work in Catholic education, and I address sometimes non-Catholic teachers, and I say, look, you have an obligation to support the mission of a Catholic school. And that's more than just, you're not going to outwardly undermine us, okay? But you have to understand what we're trying to do, and you have to work with us to promote this vision. If you're not on board with what we mean and what we're about, then you shouldn't work here.
Yeah, absolutely. Pam, thank you so much for your call. We could certainly spend the whole hour talking about Catholic education, couldn't we?
Yep.
There it is. We're going to get to that text in just a moment here from Crystal in Cleveland. First, I want to tell you about Catholic News Agency. If you're not familiar with it, it's the only fast, reliable, and free Catholic news source that brings blogs, stories, opinions, and more to your fingertips. For the latest Catholic news, I encourage you to visit CatholicNewsAgency.com. This is an online service from EWTN. Just looking at the CNA website right now, one of the headlines, "Speak Up for the Voiceless." Vice President Pence encourages at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast, which was a couple of days ago. Also, the attack on police near Notre Dame Cathedral shakes up Paris. This is very important news. You need to be informed. You need to know what's going on in this world that we find ourselves in. So go to CatholicNewsAgency.com. It is a free service of EWTN, and it's a wonderful resource for you. Here's that text now that we were talking about that we got from Crystal in Cleveland, Ohio, and I wanted to kind of clear the decks here to give you time to respond to this because it's very important. Crystal says, "I have not been to church ever, but I do believe in God and I do pray. So my question is, how do I know I'm not going to hell? I have never been baptized. I have never been to a mass. I am going through some tough times in my life, and sometimes I contemplate just giving up. Listening to your show has honestly saved my life. Please pray for me." That's from Crystal.
Crystal, thank you so much. I'm so sorry for your suffering. I'm so grateful that you found some solace listening to Catholic radio. I hope you will continue to do so. When it comes to the assurance of salvation, what I propose to you are the words of Christ, that Jesus gave us some objective evidences that we are living within the will of God, some signs that we are on the right path, and that if we cling to those, we can have great hope and assurance. Okay? The means that Jesus established are the means of grace found in the Catholic Church, in particular the sacraments, above all the Eucharist, which is the source and summit of our faith. Jesus said in John chapter 6, "Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you'll bear much fruit." Okay, apart from me, you can do nothing. Okay, so can God reach the soul of a person who doesn't have access to the Eucharist? Of course he can. Of course he can. But in the Eucharist, he gives us an objective, tangible sign with a promise of his divine assistance, so that I know when I'm there that God is present to me. He's given us a sign of his forgiveness in the sacrament of reconciliation, of confession. So when I confess my sins to a priest and he absolves me, I know with certainty that God has forgiven me. Now, does that mean that God can never forgive somebody who's alienated from confession? No, it doesn't mean that. Does it mean that God's grace can't reach someone outside the Catholic Church? No, it doesn't mean that. But it does mean that in the Catholic faith, he's given us these tangible, objective signs so that we can have certainty in our act of faith and confident hope in our salvation as long as we persevere in the faith as given to us by Christ. His promise is sure. He who perseveres to the end will be saved.
Okay, there it is. Crystal, thank you so much for your text. We do appreciate that you're listening to us in Cleveland, and we hope that you keep on listening to Catholic Radio. Let's go now to Candace in St. Clair Shores, Michigan, listening to EWTN on iHeartRadio. Candace, what's your question today?
My question is, this has always plagued me, is that in Mark chapter 12, where the Sadducees tried to trip up Jesus in regards to the resurrection. The question is, I know Jesus states that there's no one who marries in heaven and that there's no marriage per se. So, okay, so people devote their time throughout life and, with a husband or a wife. And like my grandparents, they were 1 month away from 65 years of marriage.
Wow. Okay,
so, and my grandmother's obviously not in a position to remarry, and I understand until death do you part. You devote so much time. Is there still that relationship or connection between a man and a woman in heaven?
Okay, thank you so much. This is a wonderful question. I really appreciate it. So, first of all, let's just talk about why there is an institution called marriage, not just in the Catholic Church, but throughout human experience. Okay, the reason that there is such a thing called marriage is because men and women produce babies, and babies come into the world needy. They need people to care for them, not just physically, but emotionally and morally, and to raise them up and give them the tools they need to be meaningful participants in civil society. And the people that are best suited to do that are those that brought the child into the world, namely the parents. And marriage is simply the societal recognition that that relationship exists and has objective value, and that it's a value that's distinct from the value of other relationships. Marriage is not like tennis partners. It's not just some adventitious arrangement that I enter into for my own aggrandizement or pleasure or gratification. It has moral rights and duties associated with it, namely the moral rights and duties in children, all right, a father and mother together for the sake of raising a family. That's why marriage exists, okay, everywhere, not just in the Catholic world, but among Buddhists, among atheists, among anybody, okay. Now, in the Catholic Church, marriage has an added dignity, all right, that when two baptized people are married, Christ is there with them. They're members of Christ's body by definition through their baptism. And so their marriage becomes a sign of eternal realities, namely the love of Christ for his church. And the married couple participates in the ecclesial mission of the church. They enjoy an ecclesial state like priests or religious do, all right? And their marriage is a representation of Christ's love for the church in the world. And by raising children in civil society, but united to the love of God and the grace of the sacrament, they actually bring about the kingdom of God. They effect the salvation of their families and of the world. They raise kids not only to replenish civil society, but also to get them to heaven. So marriage becomes something that is now of transcendent value. Natural marriage is a value. It's of human value, right? But sacramental marriage becomes of a transcendent and eternal value, okay? Now, the question, what would be the nature of the relationship of spouses that were sacramentally joined in this life in the next life? Okay. Well, to be sure, remember, we believe not in the immortality of the soul per se, but in the doctrine of bodily resurrection. All right. So in the next life, at the resurrection of the dead, we will enter eternity embodied. Soul and body, all right? The entire created order will be renewed. St. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 8, the whole creation is yearning with longing expectation for the resurrection of the dead, that the whole created order will be renewed. So God does not want to yank us out of time and space and human history, but to redeem time and space and human history. And there is personal identity and continuity between this life and the next. And we see that all throughout the sacred scriptures. The saints in heaven who reappear, all right, multiple times in the scriptures, like, say, Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration, or Jeremiah and Onias who appear to Judas Maccabeus, or all the elders that we see depicted in the book of Revelation who have a care and a concern for the life and the welfare of the church on earth, tells us that there's historical memory and continuity between this world and the next. So when we are renewed in that next life, all of our experiences, all of our relationships that we have in this life are not of no value. Rather, they're transformed into a transcendent and eternal value, and they will all be given added glory and significance in the life to come. So I fully anticipate when I greet my wife in heaven, we will not be we won't be procreating children together,
right?
But we will have all of those experiences to rejoice and glorify God about and give thanks for all eternity.
Very good.
So it's not going to be less valuable. It'll be more valuable.
Yeah. Candace, thank you so much for your call. Deb in Iowa, listening to us on KCRG. Hey, Deb, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. David Anders. I just wondered if there's anything I can say to someone who claims to be an atheist and is suffering right now a great deal from a painful accident. And they kind of were raised Catholic, and but laugh it off like that's they're too good for that now. And they but suffering immensely in pain. But if you say, like, if my daughter told her, you could offer that up, she laughs.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to approach an atheist who has a philosophical objection to the Catholic Church one way. I'm going to approach an atheist who's suffering and who is in need of pastoral care another way. Okay. Because when it comes to trying to help alleviate this person's suffering, already you've told me that they're right now they're not in receive mode, as Tom likes to say. They're kind of immune to argument. All right. And I fear, my concern would be that a direct apologetic approach would be perceived as maybe even manipulative or kind of pandering. You know, I'm going to take advantage of your weakened physical condition to try to bring you around to my point of view.
Yeah.
Okay. I think a better approach at this time is to extend compassion, love, patience, rather be to this person the presence of the God that they deny. And perhaps they'll find that it's the Catholics in their life that have a greater care for their welfare, for their comfort, for their happiness, a more greater empathy for their suffering than the non-Catholics in their life, and then pray to God, to the Holy Spirit, for wisdom to discern the right time to turn the conversation to spiritual things. And if they're open, the time will emerge. There are all kinds of arguments that I can give you right now to deal with atheism, but given the pastoral situation that you've articulated, I somehow doubt that argument is the right way forward at this time.
Yeah. Deb, thank you so much for your call, and we'll certainly keep that person in our prayers. Here's a text now from John in Boise, Idaho. If none of the early church fathers at the Council of Nicaea believed in some key current Roman Catholic dogmatic teachings, like the bodily assumption of Mary, how can they be dogma?
Okay, sure, thanks. This is a very strange question because I've no evidence that the fathers of the Council of Nicaea uniformly denied the bodily assumption of Mary. I reject the premise of the question.
Okay. Well, I think he's saying here that things that were declared to be dogma later, much later after those years, let me turn around and put it this way. Okay.
The reason there was a Council of Nicaea is there was a deep, widespread, pervasive debate in the 4th century about the nature of Christ's divinity. Not all of the fathers of Nicaea believed in the teaching of the Council of Nicaea.
Wow.
Right?
True.
Okay. So the fact that there's doctrinal disagreement at some particular point in Catholic history does not count against the truth of the Catholic faith. It, in fact, counts against the truth of just about every other faith. It's only the Catholic Church that has a principled way to differentiate dogma from false opinion, and that's the authority of the Catholic Church. The same church that promulgated the dogma of Nicaea also promulgated the dogma of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Hope that's helpful for you, John in Boise. Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. David Anders.
Thank you, Tom.
My thanks always go out to Michael McCall and Jeff Burson doing a super job behind the glass. I'm Tom Price. See you tomorrow here on Call to Communion. God bless.